Hi everybody, Joseph here with Bean to Bar World, and today I'm going to talk to you about off flavors in your chocolate. So what are off flavors? Off flavors are flavors in your chocolate bars that you don't really want to find there. So thankfully none of these have any off flavors, but there are certain flavors that you definitely don't want in a fine chocolate. It's usually a sign that something was wrong, whether it was with the cacao or the chocolate itself. And there's many favorable flavors in fine chocolate, right? These bars have, fruity notes, nutty notes, caramel, herb, things like that. Those are wonderful flavors that we want to taste in our chocolate. But sometimes you might come across brands or bars where they have flavors that are not favorable, not optimal, something you definitely wouldn't really enjoy in a chocolate bar. So I'm going to go over about 6 or 7 off flavor notes that you might find in your chocolate, and I'll discuss where those come from. So the first off flavor I want to discuss is mold. So sometimes you might taste mold in your chocolate, and you might think, well, how can that be? For instance, these chocolate bars are just solid dark chocolate, right? Dark chocolate itself is a preservative. It's high in tannins and it's high in fat, and so mold can't really grow on it. You can have chocolate bars sitting around for months and months and months, and as long as it's not susceptible to moisture, it'll be fine. You won't have any mold growth on there. And so there are brands and bars out there that do have that moldy flavor to them. Years and years ago, when I was at a chocolate shop, a retail bean-to-bar chocolate shop, the owner there gave me a sample of from a chocolate maker in France. I don't remember exactly who it was. One of the top well-known French bean-to-bar makers. And she said that it tasted like mold. And so I tasted the chocolate. It was just a plain dark chocolate. And it had a really strong blue cheese moldy flavor. Not a subtle flavor. You could really taste that. And so it's surprising because this is a brand that's been around for years and years and years. Somebody along the way perhaps didn't check the quality before they packaged them and shipped them out. It wasn't moldy, it wasn't bad, it wasn't going to make you sick, but it had some of those off flavors. So where do those off flavors come from? Usually they come from the processing of the beans. So when farmers pick their cocoa pods, they open up the fruit and they take out the fruit and the seeds and they ferment it. And then those seeds, those cocoa beans, are dried and then stored before they're shipped off to chocolate makers to make chocolate. Now it's usually in the storage drying phase where things can go wrong. And there's another chocolate maker that also, it's a bean-to-bar chocolate maker from the States, who repeatedly, their chocolates always had sort of a moldy flavor to them. This is a brand that's really well known, in some ways respected in the bean-to-bar chocolate world, but unfortunately they do a very poor job with the overall flavor and also even storing their beans. So there was always this off flavor of mold, and it was hard to understand where it was coming from, and there was different bars that they made. And one of a chocolate friend of mine actually visited them and saw how they were storing their cacao beans, and there was a lot of mold growing on them. And it's not unusual for beans and a lot of things like that to have something sort of growing on them, because the shell's going to be removed, they're going to be roasted. So if there's a little bit of that here and there, that's not a huge deal. But it seemed to be a big deal for him. He saw quite a bit of it on there. And you could actually taste it in the chocolate. I'm very surprised when I see other sommeliers promote this bar, because I tried it again years later and it still wasn't very good. So there are instances where your chocolates will not be moldy, not make you sick, but because of the way they were stored, if there was mold growing on the shells or anything like that, that flavor, that aroma would be absorbed by the bean. And so even after they were shelled and roasted, those moldy flavors never really leave. They kind of stay there. It's hard to get that out. And so be aware of moldy flavors. Now there are some chocolates out there that tend to have very earthy tones, like mushroom, and sort of very like wet peat and things like that. That's not mold. That's something else. That's more earthy tones. But if it has a really prominent, clear, strong moldy flavor, it could be that the beans were not stored or dried properly before it was manufactured. And so unfortunately they absorb some of those flavors. So be aware of that. And like I said, there might even be some well-known brands out there that unfortunately might create bars that have these flavors in there. So be aware of that. Now the next one is a bit more of a contentious issue, sourness. Now people who are not used to fine chocolate will automatically pick up on how a lot of fine chocolates have sort of a sour note to them. Now usually I use the word sour in a more negative way and tartness in a more positive way. So for instance, this Hogarth bar, Peru bar, has some tartness to it, and it enhances the fruity flavor of the bar. So a little bit of tartness to enhance the bar, to maybe bring out the fruity flavors, is actually quite nice. But if it's very sour, if it makes your mouth pucker, if you could feel the sourness in your throat, and there are bars like that, that's not a high quality chocolate, and that's not a favorable element, taste, and flavor in your chocolate. It's not really a flavor, it's more of a taste, but you definitely don't want that in your fine chocolates. And so where does that come from? It can come from many different aspects. It can come from the fruit itself. So there are some fruits that are very sour. A lower quality cacao tree will grow fruits where the fruit inside is actually very sour. And believe it or not, a lot of people don't know this, but the flavors of the fruit itself seep into the seeds when they're being fermented. So a lot of people disregard the flavor of the fruit because it gets fermented and melted away, but it actually is quite important. And so if you have a fruit with very sour, unfavorable taste to it, like the bulk commercial cacao, then chances are that might affect the flavor of the seed, as well as how the seeds are fermented, any preconditioning that's done. A lot of people think that the farmers just take the fruits and the seeds and ferment it. But there's a lot of farmers around the world that actually squeeze a lot of the juice from the fruit to remove some of that before they ferment it, because the fermentation is what builds up the acidity. The acetic acid bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria builds up the acidity. So if there's too much sugar, if there's too much juice, you might build up too much acidity. And so there are a lot of farmers that remove some of that beforehand to, what they say is, improve the flavor, but also to reduce the acidity. So it can come from that as well. But if you're making your own chocolate and you're buying your own cacao beans and you know it's a reputable source, a lot of people use their beans and they don't have super sour chocolate, and you're still getting sour chocolate, it could be your method of how you're roasting and refining. So don't under roast your cocoa beans. First of all, under roasting will not allow to cook off and kill any bacteria or anything like that left on the shells from the fermentation and the storage and all that sort of stuff. So you have to really roast it well. Usually 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 to 30 minutes is a good ballpark. Usually a bit more, not usually above 300, or you start to kill the flavors of the cocoa bean. But you want to roast it well. And there are some makers out there that are raw chocolate makers, so they don't roast, or they very lightly roast their cocoa beans. And they do it in a way that's still hygienic and still okay to eat. But what the roasting does is it really burns off a lot of the acidity. The drying burns off a lot of the acidity too. Let me take a step back. So after the seeds are fermented, they're dried. If they're dried too quickly, the shell locks in the acidity and any moisture in the nib, and it doesn't allow it to evaporate. So it could be more acidic in that way. But then when the chocolate maker takes the beans, they have to roast them well to burn off some of that acidity. And then also they have to refine it well. If you don't refine it, if you only refine your chocolate for 6 to 12 hours, usually there's still a lot of acidity in there. A lot of the harsh flavors that you taste in your cocoa beans, those are basically released, oxidized, evaporated during the refining process. If you have a very short refining process, you're not allowing enough time for those harsh flavors and elements to leave the chocolate. So it's very important to refine it properly. So if you're making your chocolate and it's very acidic, one, it could be the beans. If it's not, it could be the fact that you're not roasting it enough and you're not refining it enough. So if you're new to bean to bar making, I always recommend refining your chocolate at least 48 hours or more and taste it along the way at every 12 hours just to see the flexibility of your chocolate, what sort of flavors you can get from it. A lot of people under refine and under roast their cocoa beans. They think that if they under roast it, it's going to have a more pronounced, interesting flavor. Not true. The roasting is what builds a lot of the aroma compounds that create the beautiful floral, fruity and flavors such as that. You don't want to over roast it either, but definitely you want to roast it well. And so again, there's another brand out there, another American brand, which is very well known and unfortunately somewhat respected in the bean to bar world. And their chocolate is very sour, always very sour. And it's a brand that, you know, markets very well. They do very beautiful branding. And some people are put off by that. And if that was their first experience with fine chocolate, they might never return to it because of that. So it's unfortunate that some brands of chocolate that do a really good job branding themselves and growing their company, some of them unfortunately produce really bad chocolate because quality is not number one for them. It's more about building the business itself. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the world, a lot of consumers, a lot of people in the public who've never had fine chocolate. And if that was their first try of it, they might be turned off. If they tried that brand that had the moldy chocolate, then they might be turned off from fine chocolate, saying, I'm not spending $10, $15 on a chocolate bar to taste moldy or to taste super sour. So this brand that I'm talking about, you actually feel the sourness in your throat. And there are some origins that tend to be a bit more tart, right? Madagascar, sometimes Peru, Tanzania, maybe Vietnam sometimes. Even origins that are never sour tart. This company tends to make it super sour. I don't know what they do. Maybe they actually add citric acid to it. That's a joke. But it's so sour that it feels like you took a shot of vinegar after eating the chocolate. You could feel it in your throat. That's not high quality. If you've ever came across chocolate like that, it's not that great. Now, like I said, sourness is a bit contentious. There are some people that say, well, I don't like any sour at all. That's a bit more subjective. If you don't like any tartness at all in your chocolate. But to have it overly sour is not a sign of a good quality chocolate. There was one lady I had in one of my tastings, and she's actually from the city where this sour chocolate maker is, and she went on a tour. And so she learned a lot about fine chocolate, and I told her about this. I didn't mention the name, but I told her about companies out there that have very sour chocolate and that it shouldn't be too sour. And she mentioned that she went on that tour, she tried the chocolate, and she actually didn't like it very much. And she was embarrassed or shy to say that because she's a newbie, right? She doesn't really understand the whole bean to bar fine chocolate world. And so she felt like, well, maybe I just have an unrefined palate. And so that's an issue too, is if you have chocolates that have a lot of off flavors that are marketed and branded, and you have other sommeliers saying, you know, this chocolate's really popular, you got to have it. It can really put a lot of people off from all fine chocolate. You know, they're not going to spend the money anymore. They're not going to spend $10, $12, $13, $14 on a chocolate bar anymore if the one they tried tasted really moldy or very super sour. Now, another flavor in your chocolate that you don't want is burnt, right? So there are a lot of chocolate bars, single origin dark chocolate bars that have, for instance, smoky notes. Some people might say toasty, might even go a bit smoky, but in a good way. You know, there's good smokiness and there's bad where it tastes like it smells like a cigar or a cigarette or something burnt. When I was working at a chocolate maker in New Zealand, they were getting some chocolate or cacao beans from Solomon Islands, and when they first got it there, because of the way the climate is in that area, it rains a lot, they can't always put their cacao beans out in the sun to dry. And so many makers around the world who can't sun dry their cocoa beans artificially dry their cocoa beans in different methods. And one of them is to have basically sort of a wood burning stove that has pipes that transmits the heat underneath the cocoa beans so that they dry off. Well, this grower, this establishment was drying their beans in that way, but there was a lot of, the equipment wasn't well made. There was a lot of holes, and so a lot of smoke was seeping out into the air and being absorbed into the cocoa beans. Now, when I was there, I never actually tried this chocolate, but they said that originally the chocolate tasted like a cigar. Like, it was really bad and smoky. And they were disappointed because they really wanted to support these farmers. And so what they did is they actually went there and invested and helped their infrastructure a little bit more. And so they were able to dry their cacao beans more properly without the infusion of that smoke. So, you know, sometimes when you taste cocoa beans that are very smoky, almost like cigarette or like cigar smoky, it could be from that drying process, most likely. Now, like I said, there are bars that have a little bit of a strong, toasty, smoky flavor to it, even a tobacco flavor, but not in a cigarette. You know, there's a difference between tobacco and cigarette. Tobacco, fresh tobacco itself, has a beautiful, nice aroma to it. Comforting, light, earthy flavor to it. So that's okay. You don't want to, you know, discredit all those sorts of flavors. But when the bar tastes burnt, there was another chocolate maker who wanted me to try his chocolate years ago, and unfortunately it was not very good. And I tried to be as nice as possible. You know, whenever people come to me and want my opinion, I never discourage them from making chocolate, but I'm honest about what it tastes like, and I always give them ways to improve. And so I asked him, you know, what are you doing? How can I help you? But he was just really offended that I didn't like his chocolate and blocked me. So what are you going to do? But his chocolate did taste definitely burnt. It was definitely burnt, and it was probably due to over roasting. And unfortunately, I think he's still making chocolate. So be aware of that. There's chocolate makers out there. You know, it's in some ways, in many ways, it is an art, right? And who are you to go to an artist and say, I don't like what you're doing, I don't think it's good quality? I mean, as a person, you can have judgments on anything, really. It's up to you to have judgments on things. And it's good to be discerning. A lot of people, there's some people that say, I've never met a chocolate I don't like. Well, that's kind of a silly thing. I've tasted a lot of chocolate that I don't like. And it's good to be a discerning person, have a discerning palate. If you're a sommelier, it's very important to be discerning and not just sell whatever sells, you know, to really push forward the bars and the brands that are doing a really good job. Now, another one is Hammy flavor. Hammy flavor. So it's kind of I wouldn't say porky flavor per se, but basically a flavor that sort of tastes kind of like the way ham smells or something like that. It's hard to describe, but that's usually from an issue during fermentation. And so that's very, very rare to come across. That's something that chocolate makers might taste in their cocoa beans, but that's not usually something that as a consumer you have to worry about in your chocolates. It's very rare for that to come up. Usually it's caught at the cocoa bean level. But that's an issue with fermentation. So when the cacao beans and the fruit are fermented, they're fermented somewhere around 50 degrees Celsius and anywhere from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days. It depends on the variety of the cacao, how tannic it is. And so if the temperature is wrong, if the duration is wrong for the type of bean, if it's over fermented, things like that can happen. You might get a hammy flavor to the cacao bean, and if it's not caught, then that could end up in the chocolate as well. But like I said, that's actually quite rare. Another off flavor is cheesy and putrid. Cheesy and putrid. And some of that flavor comes from the fermentation again. It does come from the fermentation. So fermentation builds acidity, it builds up a lot of aromas that generally get burnt off during the roasting and escape during the refining process. If the beans are over fermented, it can really cause a putrid, cheesy flavor to the cocoa beans, which you might not be able to get rid of when you're making the chocolate, even from roasting and refining. Maybe with conching, but even so, some of these flavors are just too harsh to really get out of to extract out of the chocolate in the process. And if you've ever made your own chocolate from scratch, from the cocoa beans, sometimes in those first few hours of refining, sometimes it even smells almost a little putrid. Some people might say like a wet dog, because a lot of those flavors that we don't want that came from the fermenting, like I said, evaporate in those first few hours of the chocolate making. And so if you work in a facility where you're grinding and making chocolate all day and you leave, you might not smell it on yourself, but other people might smell that sort of putrid aroma that's been escaping, thankfully, out of the chocolate, but then landed on you. So another flavor to be aware of, There are some chocolates, especially some milk chocolates, if they're very rich with the dairy, some people might say has a cheesy flavor to it. And that's more of a dairy cheesy flavor, not a bad cheesy flavor. There are some dark, really high percentage dark chocolates, which might have a bit of a sort of a aged cheese kind of aspect to it, flavor to it. Again, it's not super cheesy. You know, it's hard for me. It's not like a Parmesan cheese, but there is sort of a cheese element to there. It's not super stinky, but it is there. That's okay. It's okay to have these favorable elements of what some people might describe as dairy, cream, cheese, yogurt. That's nice to have in your chocolate. I'm talking about something that tastes very like putrid things smell, right? I don't want to say the word. It's not very appetizing, but those generally flavors that if it's too strong, if it's there, it's generally a sign that something went wrong with the fermentation and the chocolate maker maybe didn't detect it in the bar, or didn't really have issues with it. But again, that's actually very rare. And it depends on your sensitivity. Some people are a bit more sensitive. When you have fine chocolate bars that have interesting aromas, they have an element of sourness to it, your brain, when you're thinking about the flavors, might go in that direction and you might be put off. That's a bit more subjective. So again, don't think that anything sort of cheesy or dairy-like is bad to have in your chocolate. It might not sound very appetizing if you don't really understand fine chocolate very much. But if it's very subtle and it's a more favorable cheesy element, then it's actually very, very nice. And a lot of these fine dark chocolate bars I recommend to eat with cheeses. If you want to do a pairing like no other, pair really fine single origin dark chocolates with really fine cheeses, aged cheeses from Europe or wherever, and it'll go really, really well together. The flavors marry very well, the textures marry very well. So something to think about. Another off flavor that you might get in your chocolate bars is fermented barn flavor. And there's many aspects where a bit of a fermented flavor is not bad. It might remind you of rum. There's the Lacuna bar by Cacao Suyo. A lot of people, there's just this like very gentle hint of fermented flavor in there. And it's not a bad ferment. I know some people might think that or say that, but it's not at all. And what it does is with the sweetness and the fruity notes in there, it really, the dried fruit, it really kind of allows people to think of rum. There's also very like caramel notes in there as well. So, you know, a little bit of that fermentation in there with the sweet and the fruity notes and the dried fruit and the caramel in the Lacuna bar can draw a lot of people to pick up rum in the chocolate, and it's very favorable, and people really love that bar. It's a very popular bar. So a little bit of ferment, it's not a bad thing, but if it tastes very fermented, if it tastes like a barn smells, if you've ever been to a barn that has that sort of barn musty flavor to it, that's usually an off flavor. That can be caused a little bit by fermentation, also by roasting and refining. If you're not roasting it well enough, those flavors can remain. Again, the fermentation, it's very harsh on the flavor. So we need to ferment the beans to reduce the tannins, the bitterness, but also to build the precursors to actual really wonderful flavors later on during the roasting. But even so, there's a lot of bad flavors that you want to eliminate during the processing that are built up during fermentation. So it's interesting. Fermentation is very important for flavor development, but a lot of bad flavors can be built up there as well. So that's why cocoa beans have to be roasted well in order to burn off a lot of these, and refined well, allow those flavors to escape before you have your finished product. There was a chocolate bar that I sell, a goat's milk chocolate bar, and I had some tasters who were from Japan, and this was many years ago, and I remember this because they really hated that bar. They said it was because people in Japan don't eat goat cheese or goat milk, and so for them it tasted like they were eating a barn. But for people who enjoy goat milk, goat cheese, they actually really do enjoy this bar. I love this bar. It's a beautiful goat milk chocolate bar. It's not over for me at all. It's not farm or barn at all. You do get that goaty, essence to it, which you might get from goat cheese. And if you're not used to it, it might multiply that intensity of sort of the barn flavor that some people get who are not used to strong cheeses, goat cheeses, and things like that. So there's some subjectivity there too as well. Some people might say this bar tastes very barn and whatnot because they may be more sensitive to certain flavors. Doesn't mean it's actually doesn't mean it's actually improperly made, doesn't mean the bar is low quality at all. It could be a bit more subjective there. Some of these off flavors are a bit subjective to a degree. I mean, there are some where if it's like really sour, really moldy, really barn-like, it's just not a good chocolate at all. But if it's not really, let's say, barn-like or fermented, but your brain kind of goes there, because that's how flavor works. A lot of people think that when it comes to flavor, there's sort of flavor aroma compounds in the bars, which there are, and that those are the ones that you're picking up when you're tasting. No. Flavor, they get confused a lot. Taste is what we pick up in our mouth, sweet, sour, bitter. Aroma is what we pick up either when we sniff or when we exhale. Those are the aroma compounds in our food. But those together, along with what we see, what we hear, what we feel, background memories of other foods and smells, get processed in the brain to create the flavor perception. So flavor is not something found in our foods. And so that's why a lot of people have disagreements with the particulars sometimes about what the suggested flavor notes are in a bar, because flavor doesn't work that way. There's no right and wrong per se. A lot of people might pick up sort of a certain spectrum. They might say nutty, hazelnut, almond. They're kind of in that, they're paralleling each other, but they're picking out different specifics. Some of that is due to just being a beginner and not being able to articulate yourself properly. You're not as consistent. And some of it's due to the fact that we have different aroma receptors in our nose. We have different references in our brain. So keep that in mind. A lot of people think that they have to pick the right flavors in a bar. And there is a lot of consistency with certain flavors and spectrum of flavors, but it's impossible to get everyone to taste the exact same thing. And if you are trying to taste sort of what's the suggested flavors on the bar and try to warp your mind, that you're not tasting properly. And you don't really understand the concept of flavor either. So I recommend that you check out my website and learn a bit more on that before you frustrate yourself even more. And a few other off flavors that might come into chocolate is metallic and medicinal. Sometimes they overlap. It's hard to really distinguish the two, but sometimes you might taste a little bit of a metallic note, maybe a medicinal, like an aspirin sort of flavor. That's the best way I could describe it. Where it's got like a little bit of that bitterness, but it's not a very nice flavor, right? If you ever tasted or chewed on a aspirin or Tylenol or something like that. It's not usually very strong, but there have been some bars out there that have that element to it. Again, that's not something you really want to taste in a fine chocolate. That's not a favorable element in your chocolate. And again, most of these off flavors that I talked about are very rare. You're not going to come across them very often. The sourness you will, the moldiness once in a while, but the other ones it's very rare. So keep that in mind when you're making your chocolates, if you're tasting chocolates. Keep these off flavors in mind, and that will help you to be a more discerning taster. It'll maybe navigate and guide you towards bars or brands that don't have these off flavors in them, and you can enjoy their bars much more. So thank you for joining me for this segment of understanding off flavors in chocolate. If you have any more questions, feel free to contact me. Check out beantobarworld.com/suggestions to suggest video topics and other content that you'd like to see on the website. I'd be happy to help you with that, and hope to meet with you again soon.